Texas. And Seema Samar has a late flight, will not be able to join us tonight, but at least we got her tracked, and she will be with us tomorrow. I will save the speeches for tomorrow. Delighted to have our A&M provost here, Dr. Sorry, there's a coup. Hand over your keys.
I'm fine.
Yeah,
I have a few things to say now.
Dr. Carrie Watson and Dr. Nance Watson. Just delighted you could all come. Delighted we're here tonight in this facility, this President's Dining Room, President Bush 41's. We're going to make a little history tomorrow, and delighted that you have come to write that for us. I think we have colored Alissa Rubin of the New York Times into making some remarks as we enjoy desserts. And if you're extremely nice in the course of dinner, she will take some questions. And Valerie Hudson, who is the architect of this whole event, does so much of it. I'll now tell you what you're going to be doing over the next 24 hours or so. Listen and take notes. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't tell you how delighted I am that you're here. Do you feel the energy in the room? It's palpable. I think Dean Crocker is absolutely right. We're going to make history tomorrow. I think you know a couple of our participants have had problems. Lauren Wolf came down with the strep throat where you get the blisters down your throat, and so she can't even talk. So her prepared remarks, which she sent to us, will be given by Patricia Lytle, my co-author of Hillary Doctrine. Gloria Steinem, much to her regret, I tell you, she's very sorrowful about this. She fell on her way to the ladies' room in a very nice restaurant. I hope it was a very good meal that she had. And even though she did not bring a bow, her foot swelled up to the size of an eggplant, she told me. So she's in a moon boot, and it's so painful that the doctor said that she could not be on an airline flight. It would simply be really bad. However, she's pulled out all stops, as has the IT department here, and we're going to have a very nice video feed of Gloria tomorrow. She's even prepared to take questions and answers, God bless her. So we'll miss them both, but we perfectly understand what's going on. Now, a few wonderful logistics. We told you, and Rainey told you, and by the way, can I have Rainey stand up? Yes. Rainey. Rainey deserves a medal. She's been an ocean of calm while I've had the jitters, you know, she's fine, Professor Hudson, and she's made it fine, you know, which is just a remarkable person. She placed the breakfast vouchers for your breakfast in that big Bush School cup that's in your basket. So if you're curious to where those are, that's where they are. Furthermore, she wants to remind you that the vans will meet you at 8 a.m. sharp in the lobby to bring you over. We're going to have a timer for the events. In addition, I'm hoping that you'll sort of keep your own time, but we will have an official timer that will give you 5 minutes, 2 minutes, be quiet. The problem is, I think you saw, is that we have a very tight schedule. We have a tight schedule. And that means that if everybody went 2 minutes over, we're going to be over an hour late, right? We can't do that. Okay. We're going to have Rainey make sure that the panel chairs and the speakers tell us how long they want to allot for Q&A, and that way we can kind of signal you when it's time to take questions. As you know, this is a large community event. We're going to have about 600 people coming and going throughout the conference. Some will stay for the whole thing, but some are kind of coming and going. Mostly Texas A&M people, but we have folks coming in from the Naval War College. We have folks who came down from Dallas. We have folks who've driven in from Texas Women's College. Francisco State is coming in. So we have a lot of out-of-town guests as well, a lot of community members. Now, all of you are very experienced, so if for any reason a question is asked that you think is inappropriate or off-topic, simply sort of say that nicely and move on, right? We don't want you to be hostage to those kinds of questions, so feel free that you can move on. And I think that's it. Randy, is there anything that I've forgotten? No, I think we're good. Have a wonderful dinner. Yes, Swanee.
Could we have a trust system so you know that if some of us are looking at phones, we're actually tweeting, not answering emails? It's a good thing when our phones are calling.
I like that idea. Shall we make a promise? We'll turn off our devices when our guests are speaking. I think that's
Oh, no,
okay.
that's another story. I was saying the office.
Oh, we want people to tweet.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a Twitter handle, you may not list. There's a Twitter hashtag for this event.
There is.
But it takes people saying, oh, Ryan Crocker just said we're making history tomorrow. And you know that. I'm not telling my 26-year-old, why don't you have a job?
It is Women in FP. Women in FP. And we do have some of our women stats coders. Could you raise your hands, women stats coders? These wonderful people, wonderful students who are working on my research project will be live tweeting the event from @WomanStats, WOMANSTATS, throughout the day. So feel free to follow, although you're sitting there, so I don't think you have to follow the, but you're right. That you may want to get involved, and if you want to do #WomenInFP, go for it. I think that would be delightful. Anything? Okay. Enjoy your dinner, and of course, we're very much looking forward to Alyssa's remarks over dessert. Thank you very much.
We've been catching up here at dinner, and you know, I just have to say a couple of things. Alissa and I were in Iraq at the same time. I was ambassador, she was New York Times bureau chief. We were in Afghanistan at the same time, same roles. Ambassadors and New York Times bureau chiefs don't get to be friends. But I am not doing the ambassador gig anymore, and I am proud to say that I consider Alissa a truly great friend. She is also an extraordinary journalist, and she just loves to be flattered, as you can see by her body language now. Alissa Johannesson Rubin, in my estimation, and I have seen a lot of great journalists in difficult places, is the best conflict correspondent working in this country or indeed in the world. It does not get any better. And she has also, to the horror of her friends, almost gotten herself killed doing it. She's just back from Afghanistan and scheming to get into Iraq. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Alissa.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Crocker, for those very, very kind words. And there actually are many really wonderful colleagues that I have too who do great work in conflict areas, but I'm just deeply moved by what you said. I'm sure many of you are tired, and if you're like me, you got up at 4 a.m. this morning to get here, so I promise I won't talk for too long, so we can all get to bed and gird ourselves for the intense sessions tomorrow. But first, I actually really wanted to thank the Bush School for hosting this conference. It's a great thing to have an entire day, even a little more than a day, dedicated to thinking about the role of women in national security and women in foreign policy. And above all, I'm really honored to have the chance to be in the company of so many luminary academics and thinkers. I come from a family where being a professor was the highest calling, and I kind of missed doing that, and it's really wonderful to have a chance to talk to so many very, very thoughtful people. And I also want to thank Dean Crocker for inviting me, because in fact it's quite hard to invite a journalist to come and speak, because we're known as skeptics and rather critical, and so not perhaps the safest bet for a conference. And along those lines, when I sent a message to the participants in the session that I'm moderating tomorrow about some of the topics I thought we might discuss, which focused on fairly hard questions and critique of US policy, one of the participants wrote me back a note, "Please, can we talk about something positive?" And so with that request in mind, I thought I would say something that is at least partly positive this evening, since it's after dinner and we don't have to be completely grim right away. When I first saw the subject of this conference, Women and National Security, Why Women Matter in Foreign Policy, it brought to mind the opening of a book that, for me, has been a lodestar since I was about 20 years old. The book was written 80 years ago, a long way from Texas and a long way from Iraq or Afghanistan. It was written in a small study in the Bloomsbury neighborhood of London, which at the time was populated by writers and artists and intellectuals. And the book is A Room of One's Own, and the writer is Virginia Woolf. And it's perhaps the clearest articulation that I've ever found of why it is so important to create space for women to realize their potential. Woolf was writing about writers, but the same point could be made for any kind of work or any calling. And those of you who know the book will remember that in the first lines, Virginia Woolf contemplates the request to give a lecture at Oxbridge University, which is a sort of conflated, fictionalized version of Cambridge and Oxford combined. And she says, "You have asked me to talk about women and fiction. Now, did you mean women and what they are like, or women and the fiction that they write, or women and the fiction that is written about them, or a mixture of all three?" And she concludes it's a mixture of all three, and that there's one fatal drawback. I should never be able to come to a conclusion, and all I can do is offer you an opinion on one minor point, which is that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. Similarly, I would say, for this context, a woman must have a measure of freedom if she is going to chart her own life. So as I considered what the topic national security and women's insecurity might mean, I thought, well, should I be thinking and talking about Hillary Clinton and her views on women and foreign policy, or should I say something about Susan Rice, who I didn't know too much about her views on national security, but I could have researched them, or should I talk about fears of girls in Sudan of genital mutilation and whether the United States should grant them asylum, which is an important question. But I concluded that what I should talk about is what I know, and what I know are the countries I've worked in and the women that I've written articles about and spent time with and interviewed over and over. And those countries include Iraq, where I spent nearly 6 years, and Afghanistan, where I spent about the same amount of time, though broken up in two parts, and then smaller amounts of time in the Balkans. And everywhere I worked since I came overseas to cover the expulsion of Kosovar Albanians from Kosovo by the Serbs, I've found myself reporting and drawn to really war and how civilians in general and women in particular cope with it. And in most of those places, the US and other Western countries, particularly Western Europe, have had some policy. It was inchoate in the early years. It's becoming more and more articulated, of trying to help women. And the intentions are always good. And many of those trying to execute the policies are very smart. They care a great deal. Yet with all the best intentions and a great deal of money, there's often only a marginal impact. And I've been haunted by why that should be. And I don't think I'm going to have an answer, but what I've tried to do is to look for some guides that could help me in thinking about what would actually help. And in thinking about that, I went back to my high school and freshman college teachers who taught me Virginia Woolf, and I remembered what they always said when I was confounded by an assignment. They would always say, go to the text. In this case, the text is the women themselves and listening to what they have to say and how they deal with the challenges of their society. Because I really believe that in so many places, there are sort of shreds of the answers already there, and we have to find ways to build on them. So for the next few minutes, I'm just going to focus on Afghanistan and Afghan women. And that's not because Iraqi women have less to say or are in less need of support. Their problems are different, and in some ways, their national security challenges right now are far more severe than those of Afghan women. They're facing terrible difficulties. But many Iraqi women did have the advantage of the Ba'athist regime, and one of the very few positive things about the Ba'athists is that they viewed women as needed participants in the act of governance, and that put women in a somewhat different place than Afghan women. Also, Afghanistan offers a sort of worst-case scenario for women and therefore presents more starkly the challenge for the United States in formulating policy that can help them. It would be the same in some of the African countries as well, which have really terrible situations for women. So in order to keep the more positive theme of my talk, I thought I would tell you a little bit about why I'm at least a little optimistic about the possibilities for Afghan women and how much the U.S. really can learn from them and then build on those lessons to support them. And I'm not trying to minimize. I don't want it to seem as if I'm minimizing the challenges. They're absolutely enormous in Afghanistan. And while there are gains, there's also a lot of slippage, and many parts of the country are now facing civil strife, and that is a situation in which women are always on the front lines of risk. And I just returned from a 2-week trip to Afghanistan, and in just that time, I reported on 2 egregious cases. One was of a young girl who was defending her father, who was falsely accused of stealing a gun, and both of them were whipped publicly and sort of tied to a tree, really ghastly. And the other was a young girl of 17 who was beheaded by her husband. She had tried to get away from him, tried to get a divorce, but was coerced to going back to him and was murdered 2 days later. So you might say, so what's there to be positive about? Well, I think what there is to be positive about are some of the extraordinary individuals. And if you do what I do, you talk to women much of the day. And I've been working on a project on women, so I talk to one after another. And many of them are exceedingly impressive, really independent and dedicated to trying to help other women within the context in which they can move. And that's always a little bit larger than as Westerners we might recognize when we see the veils and the burqas. We don't always look hard enough. So I'm going to go back to my first encounter with Afghan women, which was in 2002 in Khost province. And it was just a few months after the Taliban fell. And I don't know how many of you know Khost province. It's a very troubled place, had a lot of Taliban. It was one of the last places where the Taliban fell, one of the southern provinces. It's on the border with Pakistan. It's sort of a direct route to the Haqqani Network's headquarters, and lots of Taliban have gone through. They've been killed, more of them come up. So it's a very turbulent place. And it had also been a home to a lot of al-Qaeda fighters. And so journalists in 2002, you have to remember this was right after the Taliban fell, went there to try to learn about al-Qaeda, because we didn't know very much at that point. And so I was trying to avoid just tromping around a cave and picking up bullets, which was what some of my colleagues were doing. So I decided that, well, perhaps people from Al-Qaeda got sick occasionally and went to the hospital, because after all, they're human and it might have happened. So I washed up at the hospital, and I was immediately taken aside and put in a room separately from the men, and 2 male doctors came and said they would bring someone to talk to me, and they brought me 2 women doctors. And they were very forthright. One even spoke a little English. And they, to my surprise, they had been working there all the way through the Taliban. And because the Taliban did not want their wives or daughters, if they got sick, to see a male doctor. And so there had to be somebody there to do it. So these women who were communist trained from the 1980s were still there and still working, and quite knowledgeable. And one of them said, look, I'd like to take you on a tour of our hospital. And I said, oh, of course, I'd be happy to go. So she took me out, and then a male doctor materialized, a young man, and he said, well, I'll come too, just make sure I got the full tour. And as we walked around, we walked into a men's ward in one of the buildings, and it was about half full. And the woman doctor turned to me and said, you know, this is all going to change now. I think we can make this into a pediatric ward, and the men will just have to go somewhere else. They don't fill the ward anyway. And the male doctor looked absolutely startled. She said, yes, come on, Hamidullah, look at these men. The ward's only half full. We're wasting space. In pediatrics, we have children lying on the floor. I think we can move out the men, bring in the children and their mothers. By then, he looked sick. And she turned to him and she said, but it makes sense. Our children are the next generation. I don't know what he thought. I don't know what he said afterwards. But he didn't dispute with her at all. And he could have. I was standing there. I didn't speak Pashto. I mean, my translator might or might not have translated it. But he looked a little bit cowed. And what I learned from that was something that I've come back to over and over. It's that if you can find the right middle-aged women or even older women, they have considerable sway in the community. They have some standing. And young women and girls almost always sort of lack that wasta. So if you need to introduce a program, to get something done, to move, to sort of begin to open people's minds to something a little bit different, a very good intermediary can be an older woman in that society. And that was a kind of revelation to me that I hadn't expected. And another group that I learned it was also really important to have on board were men. And at first, it can seem sort of antithetical, because men already are the beneficiaries of a great deal of the West's largesse, and you feel like if they're part of women's programs, well, my God, they're just getting more. And is that fair, and is that useful? But increasingly, I saw that men were a crucial part of any women's efforts having credibility, especially in more rural areas or in more conservative areas. And one place that really came home to me was in Jalalabad. I heard there was going to be a family mediation center open there by Women for Afghan Women, which is a very impressive organization that runs shelters and family mediation centers. And I had spent a lot of time with them, and I spoke to the woman who was in charge of it, and I said, really? In Jalalabad you're going to do that? And Jalalabad is Pashtun, very conservative. It's tribal, it's lawless, it's people settle scores using women, they beat them. I visited victims, at least 3 victims of botched honor killings in the public hospital. In one case, the family waited till the woman was able to come out and then killed her because they'd failed the first time around. It's such a difficult place to work for that kind of project, where shelters are still seen as potentially houses of prostitution. So anyone who works in a shelter is kind of at risk. So the woman who ran it said, oh, just go and see what she said, I think we've got a strategy. So I went to their office there, and I was immediately taken in to meet the head, and usually the head in their office is some very serious woman, sometimes a lawyer in a long skirt and a big veil who doesn't, looks fairly conservative. But this time it was a man with a long white beard who looked, and it turned out was, a mullah, and his name was Hayatollah Talibzadeh, and he was the person who had really made it possible for them to open there, because he had credibility with sort of the elders of that in Jalalabad, so that at least, even though they thought he was probably reading the Quran a little bit wrong, he was a learned person and couldn't be just discounted. And today they actually have a shelter there, which is really extraordinary in Jalalabad. And that, to me, is a sign of some possibility, and doing it slowly and doing it with a person who's local and can be an intermediary, so that it's not something Western and alien coming in to sort of take over or attempt to change things. And the last person I'll talk about is a politician, a local politician, whose name was Marjana Kochai Khan. And at the time, I think it was 2012, 2013, she was the only, or one of two, there was a dispute because it was a difficult province, female provincial council member in Oruzgan province. It's a very, another conservative place in the south, and she was quite courageous, I think, to serve as a politician. Her brother and nephew were murdered, and her family was very upset, and eventually they apprehended the killer, and they called a jirga, a traditional meeting to determine what they were going to get in return for the two deaths. And the person they put as the head of the jirga was the police chief, who is also a sort of notorious character, who perhaps Ambassador Crocker will remember, Matiullah Khan, who was managed to both sort of work with the Taliban and the US military at the same time, and earned a lot of money doing it. But he was one of the more respected people. He was powerful, and he managed not to be assassinated, so that gave him quite a bit of power. And Ms. Kochai told me that my family went to the jirga and said, we want 6 girls and money. And when she heard that, she was very disturbed, and she went privately to Chief Matiullah, and she persuaded him that there might be another way, and asked if she could come and participate in the jirga. And he agreed, who knows why, and she went, and she said, I sat with my brothers and my family, and I said, I strongly oppose taking the girls. It's not legal to victimize innocent girls for their brothers' and fathers' crime. Because what would happen is that these girls would be forced into probably marriage into this family, and would be basically treated as they'd probably be like a 3rd or 4th wife, treated as essentially a slave. And it's a horrible life. And she recognized that, and she said, I suggested the option of money instead. And the family agreed to accept $60,000 for each of the men who were killed. And she said, that worked very well for us. Now we have to figure out what to do for poor families where there isn't $60,000. She wasn't Western educated. She wasn't even very educated, but she simply knew that BAT, the system of trading girls, was wrong. And it was something that shouldn't happen to any girl. And I saw how she had used a traditional structure that my inclination would have been to think could only come up with an unfair answer. But it had actually managed to come up with a fair one. Now, it's how can something like the US government or programs support the culture without seeming to try to manipulate it? That is a very, very hard question. But all of these women gave me an understanding that Afghan women are much more than the victims that they're often depicted as. They're very resourceful. they're survivors against extraordinary odds. And so they have to be where we start, I believe. And so to that end, I want to return to Virginia Woolf and her ideas about what it takes for women to chart their own course. Her answer is one worth bearing in mind, because it's that it takes not years, not decades, but centuries for women standing on the shoulders of those who came before them to realize their full potential. And she's talking about women in England in the early 20th century in a time of peace. And most of the places in the world where we're worrying about women were nowhere near to a time of peace, and they are in a much, much earlier stage of development. So in countries that are far poorer and torn by war and a rural tradition that runs very deep, it's much, much harder. But I think if we're honest about what is possible and ask both women and the men who care about women over and over what they believe would help, and if we're willing to stick with it, not for a year or 3 years, not for the congressional time schedules, but for decades, and figure out a way to make the financing work over a long term, not large amounts necessarily. That's not what makes the difference. It's, I think, the consistency. If we're willing to do that, then I really believe the women I met, like Marjana Kochai, and the women doctors and girls in shelters who have the courage to leave their families, which is such an enormously brave thing to do in a country where your whole identity is hinged within your family. All those women will begin to have the space to make choices about what they want, about education, about professions, about politics, about family. And slowly, they'll begin to have the freedom to choose their own path, and that will become part of more and more women's lives. I'm happy to answer questions if you want. I don't know that anyone has any.
Sure. Alissa, I heard you talk about how you listen to the women and the men and ask what's possible, how we help. And I have a feeling that you've asked those questions. What answers do you hear when you ask that question?
Well, regrettably, one answer you hear, which is very difficult to know what to do with, is that they don't want to be told anything by the West. And they feel, after years of the last basically 15 years of aid, that there's been, they've been to a lot of workshops and seminars. I mean, these tend to be more, not necessarily middle class, but more professional people, and they don't want to be told what to do. And yet, they do want something that is both humane and humanist, and that reflects some sense of human rights. And so the dilemma, it seems to me, is how do you help people get there without seeming to tell them and without telling them what to do? And that's very hard. But that's one thing they say. And I think the other thing is that they really want their traditional society respected. So if you're going to put it aside, you have to do it in the most sensitive way, so that somehow people don't feel it's being discounted. So, I mean, that's what was so creative to me about the woman's substituting money for the girl. She recognized there was going to have to be a trade, and it was maybe going to be difficult, and people might have to sell land, or opium, since it was gone, but whatever, they were going to have to do that. But it was something that was a step towards what's right. I mean, we wouldn't resolve a murder that way, but they do. So you have to deal with that. So that's an incomplete answer.
Something about Virginia Woolf and the context of that, which is ultimately about women's education So what's the role of education here? I mean, you know, it's a difficult thing to talk about, so the West shouldn't tell you what to do, but what is the, what, you
Well,
know, what is the role of education?
I mean, education is everything. I think if it can work, it's got to be the most important thing. Because when someone can read and do math, they are so far ahead. And they can become powerful within their family because they can do that. The difficulty in Afghanistan, and I think we're just beginning to see some of the problems that occurred over the last few years, is there was an explosion in the number of schools and kids who physically went to school. But the amount being taught, the level of teaching, with very few exceptions, was really, really poor. And it's a big dilemma. It's important to have kids going to school. There are no doubt some of them who, because their parents are helpful, there are many more people, I'm sure, today who are able to read, but it's still, I just was looking at some UNICEF numbers. It's something, like, it's not even 30% of women yet who are at a pretty low level of literacy. I mean, you still have serious problems with the police where and they're men, so they will have had more of a chance to go to school for longer, and where, I mean, they can't write up a report. They can't write. They can't. So they're holding these literacy classes at the same time for the police. These are grown men, though. It's very hard to learn at that stage. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's difficult. So there are enormous, enormous barriers. But education is the most important thing. I think if they could now concentrate on improving it, that would be a big step. But what do you do now in places where there's conflict? If there's conflict, people will not send their daughters to school. And one of the things that the government's now doing is they're starting community schools, which I'm rather discouraged by. I mean, I guess it's a debate, but they're very much what happened under the Taliban. So basically, somebody in the village has a bunch of girls come to their house, and maybe the person teaching them has a 7th grade education, if you're lucky, and you don't have any exposure to anything a little further afield. You don't have a teacher that has any real teacher training, and it can be ended, and the curriculum can be set by whoever runs the village. And that's often very, very conservative people who don't want women to learn, or maybe don't even want anyone to learn. I mean, it's not always just women. Those can often be boys too. I'm sorry if I went on too long. So. Okay.